central concept in 89 is logic, but it's not at all clear what Wittgenstein means by logic there. If we look ahead to section 92, where Wittgenstein refers to various questions as exemplifying what he means by logical investigations, it looks as if the paradigmatic logical investigations, which illustrate what he has in mind, involve questions as to the essence, the Wesen, of language, propositions, and thought. But looking back to section 89 itself, we find we have a very strikingly different sort of example. Of all the examples that Wittgenstein might have chosen, he takes Augustine's puzzlement about the nature of time. One might certainly take the question that Augustine is discussing, what is time, to be a metaphysical question. But it's not clear what exactly is meant by taking Augustine to be engaged in a kind of logical investigation when he asks that question. So one might wonder, is Wittgenstein simply identifying logic with metaphysics in general? One part of the response to that question should be, don't try to answer it too soon. What we should understand by the term logic, when Wittgenstein speaks in these sections about our conception of logic and about logical investigations, well, we should try to see what he means as something that becomes clear within the course of the discussion itself. We should not expect to start off with a setting out of what he means by logic. A second part of the response to the question is that so far as there are two distinct types of answer to the question what Wittgenstein means by logic, both types of answer need to be incorporated into our understanding. And so let me put the two types of answer another way. Running through the 45 sections that we're on, running through those sections is the idea that logical investigations are concerned especially with questions like those formulated in section 92 about language, propositions, and thought and their relation to the world, but also running through the 45 sections is a somewhat different understanding of logic that's illustrated by the question raised by Augustine, what is time? And it's illustrated also by section 116, where Wittgenstein is explicitly concerned with philosophical uses of words in general, in metaphysical questions and metaphysical investigations, questions in which we try to grasp the essence or Wesen of something. And he speaks there of the contrast between the metaphysical use of words, which is the starting point of philosophizing, and their ordinary use. So one thing then that we have in section 89 itself, but also in the whole of the 9 sections which are assigned for this session 2 of our class, in the whole of these 9 sections, we've got two distinguishable understandings of logic as concerned with the nature of all things, and of logical investigations as paradigmatically expressed in the questions about language, propositions, and thought that are formulated in section 92. There's another thing that I would particularly want to note in connection with section 89. This is the idea that a particular conception of logic is already in play in shaping the very questions that we ask ourselves as philosophers. We will see in more detail what this conception of logic is and how it supposedly shapes the questions that we ask. But there is a very striking word that we should note right at the beginning of section 89. Wittgenstein says that we are, by the various considerations up to that point, he says that we are led to the question, in what sense is logic something sublime? And that very striking phraseology is echoed then in section 94, where Wittgenstein takes the remark, a proposition is a queer thing, to have in it in germ the subliming of our whole account. The image of subliming comes up again later in that same section. We are led, Wittgenstein says, to imagine propositional signs in a kind of purified, sublimed way. And the image is altered slightly, but it's present again in section 97, where Wittgenstein speaks of thought as turned into something with a queer nimbus, with the purity of crystal. This is again a sublimed conception of thought. So already in the first section of section 89, with the idea of logic as something sublime, we have one side of a fundamental contrast that runs through the next sections as well. The contrast, the second term of which is provided in section 97. The second term of the contrast is the humble and the ordinary, and so what we have is the contrast between the sublimed, idealized, purified, and crystalline, contrasted with the humble and ordinary. And that's a very striking contrast. There's a very great deal that one might say about it, and so I'm going to invite Jim to say something about it.
So there's two topics in what Cora was just talking about that, well, it's really one topic, but I want to sort of separate out two aspects of it somewhat artificially. I mentioned them both, say a little bit about the first, and then I think we'll postpone the second till we get a little bit further into these questions, but make it clear that it's these remarks of Cora's that we just heard that I'd like to understand. So the two topics are first, just this claim of Wittgenstein's that what happens in philosophizing, and he's a very striking way of putting this, is that we sublime the object of our reflection. In this section in particular, he says we sublime logic. I take it that's one example. We sublime the proposition, or our conception of what a proposition is, what thought is, what a name is. Those are three examples we'll be seeing very soon. And I take it, there are many others in Wittgenstein. What the inner is, what privacy is, what a sensation is, what expression is, and so on. Once we get what it is to grasp a rule, we get many examples later on in the investigations. And so the first topic is, what is that? The second topic that then comes with that is, what's the other side of the implicit contrast here? Cora tried to say something about that briefly. She suggested we have a contrast here between something like the sublime, the ideal or idealized, the purified or pure, the crystalline, the rock hard, and something which Wittgenstein will use words for, like the humble, the everyday, the ordinary. We'll also get words like platitude, truism, banal. How do we understand that contrast? And how are the two terms in that contrast related to each other? Are they just opposites? And one thing we'll talk about, I think, a little bit later today is different conceptions of that contrast. Something like Russell's conception of that contrast as opposed to the Tractatus' conception of how to understand that contrast. They're rather different. But they're both under criticism at the same time here. One is more in the foreground than the other in different sections. So he's trying to criticize a number of very different conceptions of these matters at once. And so if one too specific about this, one underestimates, as it were, the scope of the criticism, I think. So that's topic for later. I'll just talk about the first topic now. So the first topic is just this very idea of subliming. There's even just a question about how to translate here the German verb sublimieren and the noun Sublimierung. In English, we actually have two candidate translations, to sublime and to sublimate. We actually, I think we have two English verbs, it turns out here, and two nouns then, a subliming and a sublimation, and two participles, sublimed and sublimated, logic and so forth. And Baker and Hacker say in their commentary, and I think this is very astute of them, that really the German is kind of working between these and sometimes veering more towards the other one than the other. So that if we just kind of opt for a systematic choice in English, we're actually obscuring one dimension of the discussion of what Wittgenstein has in mind here. So this is one of the many cases in which a language having two words where one has one. You might think greater philosophical precision isn't always an advantage in philosophy. Sometimes you want the wider semantic field, and we don't quite have one English word, I think, that spreads quite the way the German does here. I know David Wittgenstein likes sublimated better as a translation here. I think there are things to be said for sublimed as well. And as I said, I think actually one term is slightly more apt than another at certain points. I'll just, for purposes of simplicity, opt for sublime, subliming, sublime, but you should try to look at different sections and hear it each way, depending upon. And maybe, if you want, we could talk about what the different slight differences and nuance are in those choices of translation. So we sublime logic, the proposition, thought. Once we do that, we will be struck by thoughts like, and Anscombe will translate these phrases that are coming up now in our sections as, what a queer thing a thought is. Or a proposition now seems to be a queer thing. Queer is her favorite word now in English. Seems a bit dated to the American ear, I think. But that's a translation usually, but not always, of the German merkwürdig, or something queer, etwas merkwürdiges. She's not always consistent. Sometimes she translates it peculiar. Once in our sections, she translates it somewhat more etymologically, literally, as remarkable. Remarkable also has this two sides of just being literally something one could remark upon, but also something that seems quite remarkable. But there are many other ways one could go. I mean, merkwürdig, within its semantic field, in certain contexts could be translated as strange, curious, odd, I think even weird. So it's just to have a sense of this register. Anscombe translates it sometimes one way, sometimes another way. This is one of the places where even if you don't speak German, it's good to just take a glance over at the left side of the text and see there's a German word recurring. Even just through our sections here, you'll see that she translates merkwürdig several different ways. But it's not the only word Wittgenstein reaches for in this context either. Even just in our stretch, he sometimes says besonders, these things suddenly seem etwas besonders, something special. Might be the most, at least invasive translation there. So, under the pressure of subliming, these things come to seem merkwürdig. There's lots of things to say about this, and they'll come up as we look at the sections. But the thing I thought would just thematize now, which picks up directly with things we were saying in the morning session, is how delicate the task of philosophical criticism is. And this is part of what he's trying to bring out in these sections. When the object of criticism is a sublime conception of thought. And again, it's worth contrasting this with certain default conception of what we're doing in philosophy. If we think of philosophical criticism as directed at something like a thesis, a position, an argument, or a theory, I think for the most part in the investigations, that's not what Wittgenstein is criticizing. His criticisms have implications for theses and theories, insofar as they work with the sublime conception of thought. But the immediate object of the criticism is something that's prior to any theory. One's committed oneself to before one's got a theory. And there's very different theories that can try to account for the peculiar nature of thought. How can we think about what is not true? For instance, a topic will come up in section 95. How do we do that? How can we refer to what's not true? It's not. Goes back to Plato's Sophist. But what he's not interested in the first instance is which theory we take. There's lots of different kinds, as we already know just from reading Russell through the first decade of his career, who went in for about 10, one a year roughly, between 1900 and 1910 to try to handle this problem. But the initial picture of what thought is such that these different theories look like something, one or another of them is required to overcome our sense of the peculiarity of the phenomenon we're struck by. If what we're trying to get at in our criticism is this first moment in which we've started to freight things philosophically in our way of thinking about it, so that we have sublimed what thought, language, proposition, the name, is negation, then we're not going to be able to get at the truth by taking the sublime expression of what these things are, and negating it. Indeed, Wittgenstein suggests that way disaster lies. An interesting section to look at in this connection is section 4.2, which you might want to look at. It's a particularly subtle treatment of this topic. He says what happens to us is we come to the point in which it seems to us as if the form of the expression we come out with when we try to say something about, in this case, thought, in that case, relationship between thought and reality, as if the form of the expression we're saying something false, even when the proposition, faute de mieux, asserted something true. For this is what disputes between, for instance, idealists, solipsists, and realists come to look like in philosophy. The one party attacks the normal form of expression as if they were attacking a statement. The others defend it as if they were stating facts recognized by every reasonable being. They want a fact or something stronger than the thing that's captured and the thing we have to get out of the sublimated expression. And then it looks like something you could disagree with. And people do, because it now seems dogmatic and it seems to claim too much. And so you get the pendulum swing, the oscillation of theses that already Kant was worried about in philosophy. So it looks like here, when the fundamental target of philosophical criticism is this sublime way of looking at something that Cora was just talking about, then the task of philosophical criticism involves a kind of delicacy in which it seems like Wittgenstein wants to say, well, in a way, what you say is fine, but the way you want to mean it is not. And so there isn't just some simple other way to put it, which is immune to the problem. We have to come to see what the source of the pressure is that makes us even, in a sense, come to be determined to represent what the most banal or truistic of sentences say in a way that leads to philosophical understanding. And there are many moments in which this is happening elsewhere in the book. I'll just point at two that I like, just so we have some examples of this that we can have in mind as we're reading Wittgenstein's discussion. So one in the rule-following sessions, in section 195, we have an interlocutor saying, but I don't mean that what I do now, in grasping a sense, determines the future causally and as a matter of experience, but that in a queer way, the use itself is in some sense present. And what I'm doing when I say +2 right now, the matter of experience in a queer way, the use itself is in some way already present in what I say now. And then the voice that responds to this, and the text says, but of course it is, in some sense. Really, the only thing wrong with what you say is the expression in a queer way. So we have a voice here expressing what's called the Platonist thesis about rule following. The future use is somehow, in some sense, present. And Wittgenstein doesn't seem to want to reject it. This interlocutor helpfully brings out something of the atmosphere of the way in which the Platonist wants to say this by saying, but it's so queer that this can happen. And what Wittgenstein says here, or this voice responding to the interlocutor, says here, what you say is fine, except that in a queer way. But what it is to overcome the impression that's in a queer way is not just to drop the words in a queer way. It's a bad picture of a Wittgensteinian therapy, I think, to say, oh, this seems really queer to you. Chill out, it's okay. It's all right, just say that. Call it, the California reading of Wittgensteinian therapy, It's making you really anxious, but you just need to chill. No, that's not going to be a way. We have to come to understand why it seems queer to us. To achieve the ordinary requires a return to the ordinary, which is not easy, Wittgenstein thinks. To come to recover these things, they no longer seem queer. That's part of the task here. Another example, section 296, we have, this is now in the privacy discussion. Just thought I'd take two examples to bring up. This is a recurring feature of Wittgenstein criticism when what we are criticizing is a sublime conception of something. We have a voice that cries out again in the text in 296. who's feeling like Wittgenstein's denying something. He's talking about behavior requiring criteria and so forth. Not too much about behavior and publicity and what Wittgenstein's saying. So the interlocutor comes back and says, yes, but there is something there, all the same, accompanying my cry of pain. My cry of pain, there's something accompanying it here. I don't just want you to focus on the cry, I want you to know there's something here. And it's on that account, the account of it, the something here, that I utter the cry. And this something is what is important and frightful. This is what's important and frightful, not my cry, but the thing that accompanies my cry. The pain. And Wittgenstein doesn't say, no. What he says is, only whom are we informing of this? And on what occasion? This is the beginning of a further treatment of this. We get a parable of a boiling pot next. So these are two moments. We could have others. How he treats these are a little different. I mean, exactly what's required in the task of criticism isn't just instantiating a template. But what they have in common, and there are many other moments at this level of abstraction, I think we could say the work has in common, in which Wittgenstein does not simply want to deny what the interlocutor says. That way plunges us into a form of skepticism. The truth in skepticism, we might always say, is that the skeptic sees that on the sublime conception, we have something queer, and the queer thing doesn't look like something we can have. And to the second interlocutor, what he winds up saying later on, some sections later on, is, it's not a something, it's not a nothing either. But simply to deny the sublime conception is not going to suffice to engage in the treatment we want. One topic of the sections immediately after 89 is then immediately to take the Tractatus, his early self as the example, 90, 91, 92, and so forth, and see what was sublimed in the Tractatus conception of logic, thought, and proposition, specifically. But I take it's meant to be an exemplification, then, of this point he's initially trying to broach in section 89 that Cora was just discussing. And this criticism wants to bring out how, on a certain way of understanding what the Tractatus is saying, many of the things that he there wanted to say simply express truisms. He wasn't wrong to think these are just things that are shown, if we clarify. But nonetheless, they become freighted in a certain way. And I think we'll have a particularly nice example of this in our stretch of sections in section 95. So this whole topic that we've just discussed will come back again when we get to section 95 today. And with that, I'll go back to Cora.
Okay. Where I left off was just after introducing the idea of the contrast between the sublime, purified, idealized, and the humble and ordinary. And I wanted to pick up a little on that contrast, just a couple of things about it, that it is exactly that contrast which was involved in the first half of the first sentence of section 89, where Wittgenstein said that these considerations bring us up to the problem. In what sense is logic something sublime? What were these considerations that he was referring back to there, and that are vital in introducing the whole 45-section passage? Well, he had, in the earlier sections in the 80s, he had been discussing what it is for a rule to determine what should be done, and he has developed the contrast there between a kind of idealized, purified, sublimed conception of determination by a rule, and what you might call a humble conception of what it is for the rule to leave no doubt about what a person is supposed to do in applying it in some case. And he had also, in the 80s, been discussing the philosophical idea of formulating with exactitude or precision something that allegedly we had understood only in a rough or vague way. So I wanted to connect this idea of the contrast between the humble and ordinary and the purified and sublime, which which comes up in 89, or one half of it comes up in 89, I wanted to say that is very directly connected with what he's referring back to as these considerations right at the beginning. The other thing I wanted to mention and to say a bit more about is the image of logic as something sublime, the idea of a kind of subliming that is present in our philosophical approach to logic, and the way this had come up in the investigations actually somewhat earlier, at section 38, where Wittgenstein is discussing names and the relation between a name and the thing it names. In that section, he drew attention to some differences between the way names are used and the way the words this and that are used. And then he says that, strangely enough, the word this has been called the only genuine name, so that our ordinary names no longer count as real names. They're only names in a much more limited sense. So you can see the process of subliming going on there. He's referring there, apparently, to Russell. Russell had said that it was very difficult to give any case of a name that was really a name in the strict logical sense of the word, and that the only words that really are used as names in the logical sense are words like this and that. Russell is actually working with exactly the kind of contrast that Wittgenstein himself has in mind when he contrasts the idealized, purified notions that we focus on in logic with the humble, ordinary uses of words. Russell explicitly contrasts names in what he calls the proper, strict, logical sense. He contrasts them with what we take to be names in daily life, the words we take to be names in our common language. This is in The Philosophy of Logical Atomism from 1918. Anyway, what is interesting there is that Russell, this is back in 1918, and Wittgenstein in the investigations are making use of the same contrast, but in two opposite sorts of ways. Russell takes philosophy to be committed to starting from things that in ordinary life might seem unexceptionable and obvious, and moving on from there to bringing out how vague and imprecise those ordinary ideas are. And then, allegedly, what the philosopher needs to do is to set aside those apparently obvious ideas and get to something that is genuinely precise and clear and definite, something that was involved, though we did not realize it, in the vague thing that we started off from. The vague thing was a sort of shadow of the real truth that we are now after as philosophers. This Russellian conception is particularly clearly evoked actually, I've suggested it's in 38, section 38, but it seems to me also evoked in section 88 of the investigations, right before our 45 sections. So the point I want to make now is that Wittgenstein's way of treating the contrast between the humble, ordinary understanding and the sublimed understanding starts off, you could say, from the Russellian picture that he had shared. Wittgenstein suggests that this contrast can be profoundly misleading for us in doing philosophy. There is an illusion that we are under that leads us to turn our backs on the humble uses and to think that, logically speaking, there is this fundamental and quite distinct thing that is what we really want to be speaking of and thinking about when we do philosophy. So my point here is that the theme of logic as something sublime harks back to a contrast that is very clear in Russell's writings, as well as in Wittgenstein's own earlier thought. But in the investigation, the evaluation of the two sides of the contrast is exactly the opposite of what it had been. For Russell and early Wittgenstein, as they saw philosophy, the philosopher is after something purified, something made exact and utterly clear. For Wittgenstein in the investigations, the thing in philosophy that we need to do is reverse our way of taking the contrast and get back to seeing the humble, ordinary uses of the terms that we had sublimed. So here I'm going to turn over to Jim.
Thank you. So the topic Cora has just been discussing is how to understand this central contrast, which I think is the first thing thematized in our sections, in sections 89 and on. The contrast between, just to have a shorthand for it, the sublime and the ordinary. And the first thing that Cora and I are each talking about in these opening remarks is how these two moments of the contrast are even related to each other. That is, we're bracketing a more important question, which is, what do these words each stand for? We're just going to talk about, there's Blick and Block, the sublime, and the ordinary. And let's not worry too much for the moment about what Blick and Block each mean, but let's just try to understand how they're related to each other. And we'll see already there Wittgenstein is dealing with a number of conceptions of this at once, which all he's trying to put before us and treat together. I think part of what happens in these sections, 89 and following, is he tries to help us see first what he means by saying that we work in philosophy with a sublime conception of thought, language, and so forth. In the sections following that, so this will be more our task in following days, we try to understand the other side of that contrast. What it would be to have a conception of the ordinary. I will just drop a bookmark here for our future classes. I think much reading of Wittgenstein, later Wittgenstein goes wrong, by assuming we already know what the ordinary is. We have some way of delimiting that, which is no problem. And then once we've said what that is, we say later Wittgenstein wants us to head there, to the ordinary. A claim, if you will, is we can't understand what it is apart from how it functions in this contrast. It's not something we can delimit by opposing it to poetry, science, or something else. In fact, I think all those things will turn out to be examples of the ordinary for Wittgenstein. That is, non-sublimated pieces of thinking and speaking, so that when one tries to start by understanding the ordinary first, one winds up having much too restrictive a conception of it. And then he does start looking quite dogmatic, because he looks like he has all sorts of theses about things that you ought to be able to say you're not allowed to say. That's just a bookmark. So back to our topic, the contrast between the sublime and the ordinary. What's this? How are the terms related to each other? How are they entangled in each other? How close or far are they? And so let's distinguish here between two conceptions. I'll call the Russellian conception and the Tractarian conception. The Tractarian conception has already evolved as a rejection of the Russellian conception, and a rejection of certain ideas also in Frege. I think he thinks that Frege has something more like a tension between the Russellian conception and the one he opts for instead of the Tractatus. So the criticism of these three figures and how they're related to these sections then becomes quite complicated. Cora was pointing out that in section 88, we do have something that looks very much like his Russell on his mind, the sections before, and the Russellian conception. We're going to be suggesting soon that we turn to 90 and on. The Tractarian conception is also coming in as a target of his criticism. They're both related in their most crucial features of their understanding of the contrast, but we will miss the depth at which the criticism's pitched unless we see that the contrast is a generic one he's working with here that admits of these, as it were, different specifications in its conception, among them the Russellian and the Tractarian. So let's say a little bit more about the Russellian to bring out the contrast with the Tractarian. There's another passage in Philosophy of Logical Atomism where Russell's kind of, in his mischievous way, kind of almost overstating his point to get it clear, where he looks at what happens in modern physics as a model for philosophy. What's happened in modern physics? Well, we used to think that matter was solid and, homogeneously, continuous in its nature. Modern physics has shown us it's mostly empty space with little particles at a great distance. We used to think things could happen at the same time. Modern physics has showed us there's no such thing as absolute simultaneity. He gives various examples like this. But the point is, what happens? We start with ways of thinking that make perfect sense to us. And as we learn about the real nature of things, we arrive at conceptions that seem very strange and bizarre to us. But that's the actual truth. And he suggests something like this should be happening in philosophy too, if we're doing it right. We start with certain notions that seem to us quite unexceptionable. But then if we really clarify what a proposition is, what truth is, there are certain aspects that will seem quite strange to us. But this is a sign of our really getting clear and getting precise about what these notions are. And in getting them logically precise, also winding up with a way of thinking that will seem peculiar by ordinary lights. That's all right. This is what progress looks like. The sciences have done it, and we want a scientific method in philosophy. So as Cora was describing it, Russell does have a procedure. Our point of departure is one in which we start from the things in ordinary life that might seem unexceptional and obvious. We try to understand them. In ordinary life, if we look at what we mean by these things in the light of the standards that a strict logical form of philosophizing introduced, we come to see how vague and imprecise those ordinary ideas are. And then what the philosopher needs to do is to get at something that's genuinely precise and clear and definite. And for Russell, that means that the thing we're after in philosophy, on the one hand, was already involved, though in a certain way we didn't realize it, in the vague thing we started off with. But the vague thing is, as Cora, I thought, very nicely put it, also echoing certain things Wittgenstein says, a shadow of the real truth that we're after. And it seems like we need, in a certain way, to do something that feels like a journey away from the everyday to reach that precise thing, then, which will strike us as strange. Describing the Russellian conception of the relation between the ordinary and the sublime conception, the philosophically proper, Russell would say, conception of things in that way, then, and this is what Cora was just bringing out, it can look like what Wittgenstein in the Investigations is trying to do, is execute a kind of reverse direction of motion. That is, from our attachment to something like a 1918 Lectures on Logical Atomism, Russellian sublime conception of the order of things, to an unsublimed, humble, everyday conception. So it looks like it's just moving in the opposite direction. If you have something like Russell as your conception, something like that will work. I don't think the idea of a movement in the other direction works so easily if the contrast is something like the Tractarian conception, which is also, I think we'll see in a moment, under criticism. The relation between later Wittgenstein and early Wittgenstein with respect to our contrast between the sublime, idealized, purified, crystalline on the one hand, the humble, the everyday, the ordinary, Wittgenstein will also say the colloquial, umgangssprachliche, on the other, is here much more delicate than that between later Wittgenstein and Russell. But the criticism is no less deep for that, I think. For the author of the Tractatus will say in 5.5563, a section the author of Investigations will draw our attention to in a moment. He will say there that ordinary language is already in perfect logical order as it is. It's not vague. The goal of philosophical clarification is not to introduce precision in something that's imprecise. We could even say, borrowing another slogan from the Investigation, it's to allow us to command a perspicuous overview of the kind of precision that is already there. That's what a notation is supposed to do. So early Wittgenstein is interested in logical notation as early as Russell and Frege are, but he's not an ideal language theorist. The point of the notation is to reveal the underlying hidden crystalline purity that's already there, not to introduce purity into something that's impure, precision into something that's imprecise. Here, the conception of the notation is more allowing us to see through, underneath to something that's hidden from us. This will become a topic immediately at the beginning of section 90, as we'll see. The crystalline for early Wittgenstein is already in the humble. Yet he's still working, though he doesn't see it, by later Wittgenstein's Russell lights, with some of Russell's picture of how the contrast is to be understood, even if the relation between the moments of the contrast is very different in early Wittgenstein. I think I'll just stop there.
Okay. Well, what we've been talking about so far is the first sentence of our 45 sections, although we have made some connections with some of the later sections. But there's a whole bunch of other issues that come up in sections 89 and 90 about what is going on in philosophical investigation. How do we think about what it is we are in search of, and how we carry out the search? And those two questions actually lead into a third question, given what we take ourselves to be in search of, and given also how we in fact carry out the search, do we in fact misunderstand the character of our own activity? Do we fail to see the kind of activity that we are in fact engaged in? And all three of these questions are illustrated by the passage from Augustine. So what I'm introducing as another theme for us is the question how to understand what's going on in the discussion of Augustine, moving from the first sentence of 89 to the final paragraph of it. And I want to suggest that we take as a kind of pivot in this discussion the word aber in the second line of section 90, which is translated by Anscombe as however, and by Hacker and Schulte as yet. On one side of this aber is how we see what we are doing. On the other hand, there is what we are actually doing. One side of the aber is the desire to see to the bottom of things. And you get the same idea in section 90. We feel, or we're talking about how we see what we're doing, we feel as if we had to penetrate phenomena to get to see what is at their heart, what underlies what actually may go on in this or that way. When Augustine asks what time is, he isn't asking any kind of factual or scientific question, as in fact emerges in his very striking comment that if no one asks him the question he has just formulated, what is time, he does know, but if asked, he doesn't know. Wittgenstein picks up on that remark as showing us something important about the nature of the question itself. It's not being a scientific question, a question about any natural facts. For if it were a question about natural facts, his knowing them is not something that weirdly disappears if he is asked, but which he does have if he isn't asked. And then Wittgenstein says more about exactly this point. Something that we know if we are not asked, but don't know if we try to give an account of it, is something that we need to remind ourselves of. But then what exactly do we remind ourselves of when we try to respond to such questions? Well, what does Augustine actually do? And that is then a crucial part of the whole passage here. What Augustine does, Wittgenstein says, is recall to mind the kinds of statements we make about how long things last and about present, past, and future. We say such things as, Augustine's example, one syllable is twice as long as another. We call to mind such things that we say. So this description of what Augustine actually does is enormously important for Wittgenstein. This calling to mind of what we say, that Augustine actually engages in response to his own question, the question, what is time? This is not an activity that depends on uncovering new facts, but of making something clear to us through a kind of presentation of what we already know. So what Wittgenstein wants to do with the example from Augustine is to show how the two features, first, what Augustine does, and secondly, his remark about the thing he is in search of being in some sense what he does already know. These two features, what he does and his remark about already knowing it in some sense, these two features characterize what Augustine is engaging in. They characterize it as a grammatical investigation. We also need to note here a contrast that is in play in the description of Augustine's activity. Augustine's activity is not a matter of uncovering new facts. It's not a matter of grasping causal connections. What it is not just a presentation of something which in some sense we already know. It's a presentation that enables something. It's a presentation that enables us to get clear about something. It's a presentation that enables us not to get confused by such things as the question, how can it be possible to measure time? Now, here I will just give a little bit of the way in which Augustine thinks about this problem. How is this possible? How can we measure time? We can't measure time as it passes by comparing it with a period in the future, because the future period does not exist yet. The present cannot give us a measure of time, because the present has no duration. And we can hardly measure time by relating it to a period in the past, because that period no longer exists. So, if we can't measure it by the future, the present, or the past, how can we measure time? The problem obviously involves a kind of unclarity. And Wittgenstein's description of how Augustine deals with this is to say that Augustine's presentation of the use of temporal expressions is meant to allow us to get clear of the misunderstandings that give rise to the problem. Now, Wittgenstein does have 2 or 3 places where he has used the words grammar and grammatical earlier than this in the previous 88 sections. But those uses are more or less in passing. Here, in sections 89 and 90, one of the things that's going on is that the discussion of Augustine is being used to describe a kind of investigation that Wittgenstein is calling grammatical, and which is the contrast there very clearly is a contrast with any kind of investigation that involves finding out new facts. I'm certainly not wanting to suggest that in these 2 sections it's evident what Wittgenstein means by grammatical investigation. But this is where, in the investigations, that term gets a kind of formal introduction, and it's tied here to the ideas of not involving any uncovering of new facts and of bringing to mind something that is already in some sense available to us. Over to Jim.
So, Cora's pointing out that here in section 89, with the discussion of Augustine, the second paragraph, we're getting Wittgenstein exemplifying something that he's going to call a grammatical investigation. And much of our later sections is going to be a clarification of what such an investigation is. So the beginning, I think he's been doing grammatical investigations for quite a while. But now we're stepping back and trying to understand what it is that we're doing. One thing that Cora emphasized was that, one contrast, there's a lot to say about what a grammatical investigation is, but one contrast here is with anything like providing people with information, where I take it the notion of information, of facts, that Cora has here is something you might not know. I know, you don't know. That we could stand in that kind of asymmetry with respect to it. How do you know it's a goldfinch? Famous example from John Austin. By its red head. Oh, all goldfinch have red head? Yes. That is not a grammatical investigation of the sort that Wittgenstein is engaging in here. Precisely because I could not know that. The kinds of concepts that Wittgenstein is investigating are not concepts like M16 rifle, Japanese beetle, American eagle, where I might be able to tell one, but you couldn't. They're concepts like understanding, knowledge, pain, human being. They're ones that he thinks come with being the kinds of creatures we are that could engage in this investigation in the first place. Our relation to these concepts is not that I know things you don't, and I'm providing effect. Contrast this with the 1918 Russell conception we were talking about earlier. Part of Russell's picture, when he models it in natural science, the physicist can tell you what's really going on here, because he knows a lot of things you don't about the microphysical structure of reality. Similarly, Russell's picture is a little bit like the philosophical expert can tell you what a proposition really is, because he's penetrated the surfaces of language and gotten at the real nature of things. That knowledge, real understanding what a proposition is, can be expert knowledge. In the conception that Wittgenstein's offering us here, philosophical understanding cannot have the form of expert knowledge. That already, I think, is a tremendous tension with much that not all, but a great deal of the practice of contemporary analytic philosophy assumes. But some strains of analytic philosophy don't assume that. No one can see that analytic philosophy itself actually involves very different forms of inheritance of a single tradition that involves people as different as Wittgenstein and Russell in it. So this involves another aspect of a grammatical investigation that Cora mentioned, that what we're trying to bring it to mind, this echoes certain things one has in the early Socratic dialogues, is something that we have to remind ourselves of. We have to recollect. We have to call back to etwas, worauf man sich besinnen muss. Not so easy to translate that, because we want the activity of we need to work to do it, but then bring it to mind. It has to come to mind, but what comes to mind is not just alien. So it's a struggle to bring into view something which in one sense we cannot help but know. But when we ask ourselves these questions, we are very unclear about them. And so it's hard to step back and get clear about what these things we cannot help but know. There's a tremendous delicacy and difficulty and paradoxicality to what Wittgenstein's saying here if we try to assimilate it, I think, to certain models of what philosophy does. And Wittgenstein's ultimate claim for saying this is the right way to think about it is it's an apt description of what we find ourselves doing elsewhere in the book. It's not a thesis. It involves some picture of what memory is and how it works, but just an apt characterization of what we're doing elsewhere, if he's right about what we find we're doing elsewhere. Cora pointed out that one of the things that interests him in what Augustine does is Augustine's own activity in trying to then overcome his puzzlement about time. Where one of the things that Augustine does, Cora said, is to call to mind what we would say under certain circumstances. We try to get clear what we do mean when we talk about measuring time. Socrates does some similar things. And so it's very important here. Again, we have very complicated relation to the tradition. It's not that grammatical investigation is something that was simply invented by Wittgenstein. I think Wittgenstein sees Socrates, Augustine, Frege in different ways as engaging in this activity. But the question is what it is to disencumber this activity so that it doesn't yield what we are calling before sublimed conceptions of the objects of our investigation. What we call to mind what it is that we would say. Later on, when we get to some later sections, we might think about who that we is, too. If that we is something we can pick out independently of this investigation, we late Europeans or we blah blah speakers of it, I think we've gone wrong in our way of trying to understand what the scope of that we is. So, now I'm going to go from here to, and just so we feel like we're making progress, and push into section 90, where Cora pointed out one thing in that first sentence, the but. I want to point out something else in that first sentence. The description, and I take this first sentence to be a description of how things appear to us if we're not working with the conception of grammatical investigation that Wittgenstein ultimately wants to give us. That is, we're working with the sublimated conception of philosophical investigation he's just described in section 89. Then, what we feel we must do in our investigation is, Anscombe translates this as penetrate phenomenon. The German word there is durchschauen. It's not so easy to translate this, I think. I have some sympathy with the choice Anscombe made in her translation. Durchschauen means to see through. I mean, a colloquial use of durchschauen, you could see through a con man's trick. You know, you can see through somebody in both languages. Durchschauen. So there is something to the penetrate. We must get to the other side of something that appears hidden on this conception of what the investigation is that he's trying to give expression to for most. But there's also a visual dimension to it. That is, it is through our having the right view of things, commanding the right gaze of things, that we see through. We don't just penetrate, we penetrate by seeing things correctly. That's what's missing in the Anscombe translation. The Hacker-Schulte translation tries to get the visual dimension of this, but I think at the cost of what Anscombe had right. They translate this, we feel as if we had to see right into phenomena. But I think that misses the important dimension of there being something occluded from view that we need to get past. What we need to get at is the heart of things, and the heart of things are hidden at us. So we need to see what underlies, what might actually go on in things being this or that way. I'm now echoing things that Cora said. And she had a number of different formulations of that. And I'm suggesting these different things that Cora said. We sort of need all of them in English to get the right translation of what's packed into the Der Schauen here, where that's trying itself to capture a certain way of looking at things that we take for granted in doing philosophy, which is itself the target of the criticism now. So, that's enough about translation. Let's take an example, one that I think Wittgenstein has in mind in the sections that follow, of a philosopher who has just this picture. He doesn't think it's a thesis. He doesn't think he's argued for it. He doesn't think he needs to. He thinks it's just obvious. Indeed, all we have to do is translate a sentence into logical notation, see how it allows us to get clear about what we wanted to say, and we see that this description must be true. That philosopher is the Tractatus. I'll quote 4.002, where he's saying something, but I'm suggesting he doesn't take what he's saying here to be a thesis, but just something obvious. What he says is, language disguises thought. So that from the external form of the close, one cannot infer the form, this means the real logical form, the real grammatical form, of the thought they clothe. Because the external form of the close is constructed with quite another object than to let the form of the body be recognized. It means this metaphor quite seriously. When we wear sweaters in the winter, it's not so you can see the form of my body, it's so I can be warm. That's not the point of clothing. Isn't always, well, increasingly, especially in modern fashion, sometimes the point of clothing is to reveal the exact shape of the body, but it wasn't always, and maybe even less so in fin de siècle Vienna, from what I can tell of the women's dresses then. So similarly, the external form of clothing, he says in the Tractatus, is allow us to communicate efficiently for various purposes, not to gather the underlying structure. This is hidden. This is what we must be clear about in philosophy. So we need to pull something back that's hidden in the outer form of the clothing of the expression of thought, to get at real similarities and differences, and also cases of mere emptiness in thought that we don't recognize because we have clothing and we don't realize it's just on a mannequin, not on a person, in this case, in a mere simulacrum of a thought. So we have a metaphor of clothing and body here, being employed to illustrate the relation between apparent outward form of thought and language, that which is open to plain view, which actually will mislead us on this conception, what's open to plain view, and the real underlying hidden inner form, which must be excavated, brought to light, dug out by the philosopher in order for him to see what's really going on. Even though early Wittgenstein, like Russell, thinks it's already there, you still have to penetrate, see through something to get to it. Let's just call this, so we have a name for this, the X-ray conception of the way in which we need to see things in philosophy. The X-ray conception involves a way of looking at things that is going to be the target of criticism, already beginning in section 90 and the sections that follows. When he said already in 89, we want to understand something, actually in philosophy, we want to understand something that's already in plain view. He's contesting the X-ray conception. But notice the X-ray conception doesn't rest on a thesis. For early Wittgenstein, he thinks it's just obvious if you just, for instance, put things in logical notation. That is right. You don't see that. You don't even see what logical notation does for you. He goes on in section 92 to say, we'll get to this, but it's worth marking this now. The essence is hidden from us. The essence is hidden from us. That is the form our problem now assumes. So the task of criticism is to understand how our problem came to have that form. What caused that? And later on, section 126, we'll only be discussing a whole bunch later, he says, in a very famous passage, what is hidden is of no interest to us. But that is connected to this way of thinking of things that he's here trying to bring out. Back to Cora.
Okay. Well, I actually, in my notes, I only mentioned one other topic that I thought I really had to mention if I was allegedly dealing with 89 to 97. But there is, I thought, an enormously important topic that surfaces in these sections in 90 and 91, and this is the role of analysis in philosophy, which, after all, gives its name to analytic philosophy. Anyway, I think it is very striking how the topic comes up within section 90 as a case of how grammatical investigation can be helpful in philosophy. Grammatical investigation, Wittgenstein has just said, clears up misunderstandings concerning the use of words, and it can do this by calling to mind what sorts of things we can say. So we might have as an example of a problem to set alongside the problem that I actually spelled out, Augustine's problem about how on earth do we manage to measure time. This Russell's problem is a problem that sets philosophy going about George IV, a very famous philosophical problem, which starts off by Russell saying that if A is identical with B, whatever is true of A is true of B. Now, Sir Walter Scott and the author of Waverley were one and the same person. That's to say, Scott, A, author of Waverley, B, A and B are identical. Scott is identical with the author of Waverley. Now, here's something that's true of Scott and Waverley. George IV wanted to know whether Scott was the author of Waverley. So, if whatever is true of the author of Waverley is true of Scott, and the king wanted to know if Scott was the author of Waverley, it looks as if it must be true also that the king wanted to know if Scott was Scott. But that's ridiculous. Here, there's a kind of misunderstanding that comes from not seeing difference in the ways different sorts of terms are used. The way the word Scott is used is different from the way in which phrases like the author of Waverley are used. So if you set out the use of such phrases, this can be a little like taking something apart, in that we see different elements in the use of the author of Waverley. So Wittgenstein in section 90 is referring to philosophical analysis as it has been practiced, and he's connecting it with his own description of grammatical investigation. Classical philosophical analysis, like Russell's famous account of the author of Waverley and similar phrases, can be regarded as a case of grammatical investigation in Wittgenstein's sense, in that it shows differences in the ways words are used. But again, what Wittgenstein is saying here is akin to what he said about Augustine. Augustine did not take himself to be engaging in grammatical investigation, but the argument given by Wittgenstein was that that's how you can describe what Augustine was doing. And again, when Wittgenstein talks about philosophical analysis as being a case of grammatical investigation, this again is a description that does not correspond to the self-understanding of Russell or early Wittgenstein or others who were doing what they thought of as philosophical analysis. So in this passage, in which the notion of grammatical investigation gets its formal introduction, it's clear that one important feature of grammatical investigation is that it may be useful and appropriate to describe what someone is doing as grammatical investigation, even though that wouldn't be the way in which the person himself or herself would think of describing what they were doing. Over to Jim.
So I think what we're seeing here, among other things, is that Cora and I really love sections 89 to 90. We have a lot to say about it. I don't think we should be too slavish to our schedule. We originally had thought we would somehow get through 97 and then talk about 97 to 101 after lunch. I think we should change our plan so we can have some discussion. I think our topic for lunch is 90 to 101, we each have some more things to say about 90, 91, especially 95. But I think we should just push those to lunch. We misbudgeted this part. I think it's partly because we wanted to have a whole bunch of sections at the beginning, so we didn't start too slow, and then we have a little too much on our plate, I think, for this first session. So this will probably happen again, and we will reapportion which sections we're discussing when. But I think I'm just not going to say anything else. And will there be more? We promise more time for discussion this afternoon and the days to come as we get our momentum. But I'd like to hear other people's voices already now, if anybody would like to object, comment, agree, disagree, change the subject. Would you want to
give
be
your
our
name?
moderator?
Should I? Yeah,
Yes,
sure,
I think
sure.
I appoint Folker as moderator.
Yeah.
So remember to say your name and university.
I'm Daniel. I'm from Berkeley.
Say your whole name.
Daniel Sharp,
That's how it's done.
California, Berkeley. So I had a question about how to read the first sentence of 90 through this sort of mediator of however rather operative. So it seems like one reading there is there's something that we feel is a temptation to see through phenomenon, and then on the other side of it there's the kind of investigation we might want to do instead. But I'm a bit unclear about who's speaking in this section, this particular contrast. So Wittgenstein says, rather, as one might say, towards the possibilities in scare quote, and then says in the next sentence, what that means is we call to mind the kinds of statements that we make about phenomena. So I know there's certain readings of these passages that put a lot of weight on what we do is get at the possibilities of phenomena. But it seems like, at least on one reading, the next sentence is negating or giving a rather different characterization than this sort of possibilities, Kantian-sounding caricature. So I was wondering how to understand the contrast there between, on the one hand, seeing through phenomenon, and then on the other hand, looking at the possibilities of those phenomena in question, and to what extent that is linked to this idea of grammar that we've sort of mentioned.
Well, I'll go first since I see Laura hesitating.
I'm trying to get the into this.
I do read it like this. I'll just sort of dogmatically throw something out. People can disagree. I take it, we feel as if we had to penetrate phenomena is a shorthand characterization of the conception we have in the first part of 89 that goes also with the conception of subliming. And then I am taking it that, so that we have this first bit, es ist uns als müssen wir die Erscheinungen durchschauen. But then he says, unsere Untersuchung, aber, I'm taking that aber to then, but it's complicated, to give us a characterization or investigation which does fit what we're doing in this book and what we're doing later. But it doesn't only fit that, and that's why it's complicated. And indeed, one person that fits is Augustine, who we just had. But this also goes with my point that grammatical investigation is not being invented by Wittgenstein, but it's a feature of philosophical exploration that is being liberated from a certain way of doing it that takes the sublimated point of departure and doesn't lose it. So I am taking what he says next to inter alia be a characterization of what we do in philosophy, we who are doing the way we do it here. And as we will try to continue to characterize in the following sections. But not only how we do it. And so there'll be a discontinuity folded within that continuity of how we do it. And Socrates, Augustine, and Kant did it. That will also interest us. So the possibilities of phenomena is going to be complicated. There's something about that that's right. I mean, I'll bring out very quickly something I think that's right about. There's many readings of Wittgenstein on criteria or Wittgenstein on use, which one finds in the contemporary literature. Bob Random's a good case of this. I think what you want for criteria is when we can speak truly of the thing, you know. The criteria for red is when it's really red. The criteria for pain is when it's really pain. So what criteria for pain should do is allow you to distinguish cases where people's really in pain from where they're pretending. And then the criteria would allow you to directly answer the skeptic. No, I think there's something we could put this way. It's connected with some criteria for the possibility of phenomena. So if somebody is pretending to be in pain, it's pain he's pretending to be in. That concept applies. Criteria are about, as it were, the intelligible application of the concept. That's something prior to the distinction between truth and falsity. We can only ask whether something is truly or falsely X if we can first project the concept. I don't know what you're asking me if you ask me if this is in pain. I do know what you're asking me if you ask me if someone who might be pretending is really in pain. So we are, in that sense, interested in the possibility. So a move Kant makes, a difference between what I've called in a different piece of writing a Cartesian problematic and a Kantian problematic, where the Cartesian problematic wants to sort between the false case and the true case. I know I might be dreaming, but now, am I dreaming or am I really in front of students? Kant's question is, what is it to so much as be able to dream I'm in front of students? To pick up on a passage we'll get 95. How could such an experience so much as be false? There we're interested in the conditions of, if you will, intelligible thought and speech, not the distinction between true versus false. And that is the level of our investigation. In that sense, our investigation is Kantian. It is directed. That doesn't mean that everything about a certain things that people call a Kantian conception of possibilities isn't sublimated. Just like there's questions about Augustine's picture of how we do this investigation. So it's complicated. That's, I think, all I'll say and answer your question so we can have other questions.
Yeah.
Do you want to add anything?
No, I'm happy with that. Yeah.
Michael?
My name is Marcos Silva from Brazil. I'd like to draw some attention for the first remark that Ferdinand made about logic and the strength thing to connect logic with metaphysics from a technical point of view. When he begins to talk about logic, you're thinking about this, talking about the discipline or the field of logic.
Yeah.
And then he goes a little further and talk about the nature of time. That to explain for a logician is very different. And that's why it's so awkward. Sometimes we think about Wittgenstein as producing something interesting in logic. And then the step further in the 90s, he says something about possibilities.
Yeah.
So, it's interesting to see that there is a similar movement, a kind of duo of this movement here in these two sections, the Tractatus as well. Just try to roughly speaking about Tractatus, if you go to look at what is technically speaking about logic there, you have to look at this proposition 6.1, and when you say, logical propositions are tautologies. Okay? And then we have all these interesting features of tautology. We have the propositional calculi, and so on and forth. And then, if you look for another instance of logic in Tractatus, you can see the traditional or is this so-called ontology of Tractatus, when you have this the idea of the conception of a logical space that determines the set of possibilities.
Yeah.
The absolute set of possibilities of these connections. You have the notion of logical form.
Yeah.
And then if you go another remarkable use of logic in Tractatus is to write in the preface. What? Tractatus. When you say, what is philosophy? Philosophy is a misunderstanding of the logic of language. And this, when you try to explain for somebody what it means about the logic of language, if you understand the logic of language, you're not supposed to do philosophy anymore. You can avoid doing philosophy. You can see that the philosophical problem is solved. You can explain this as using the notion of nature as well. So that is kind of this movement here in philosophical investigation from 89 and 90, the Tractatus as well. Kind of technical thing, and then set of possibilities, and then this nature of something that's supposed. Do you think this is, we can reduce everything one sense of logic.
I certainly wasn't suggesting we can make any reducing anything to one sense of logic. I was simply trying to bring out that even the question, what is a logical question at all, seems to have two different sorts of answer, depending upon where in our 45 sections we put our focus. And there's one bunch of questions which are very closely tied to Tractatus questions about the relation between language, thought, and world. And certainly also that those questions are connected with possibilities, in the ways in which the possibilities of the world, as one might say, reading the Tractatus, the possibilities of the world are supposed in some sense to match the possibilities of language. But these are all questions that have to do with language, thought, and world. And these questions then seem to be a narrower set of questions from the questions, what is the nature of X? Where there are questions in philosophy where we ask, what is the nature of X? And X may have a very wide range, including such things as, what is the nature of time? What is the nature of normativity, to take a present-day question, where we're not focusing specifically on the ones that seem to be at the heart of early analytic philosophy, of language, thought, and world, which certainly seem to be the focus in some sections of 89 to 133, whereas you also have these very, very much more general questions. I was just trying to bring out that you have two very different focuses in these two different ways of talking about the questions with which we are apparently concerned. I hope that's
I think a little historical perspective might be helpful here too. I mean, you're saying the way that logic is being spoken of here seems very peculiar to a logician. But I think the truth is they only seem peculiar to a 20th century logician. And especially, the longer you go in the 20th century, they seem peculiar. I mean, if you read Aristotle on logic, when he wants to tell you what the principle of non-contradiction is, it has three different variants. It's a principle that governs thought. It's a principle that governs the mind and what can be in a mind at once, about the structure of consciousness. And it's a principle that governs what is. Which things can, be compatible predicates of the nature of a thing. And it's all of those things at once. That's what logic is. And up to roughly Leibniz and Wolff in the German tradition, the history of philosophy, that's what logic was. It's the form of thought, the form of the consciousness of the thinker, and the form of being all at once. It's only with Kant that, how one form relates to another, so that maybe logic, and its relation to another topic, say metaphysics, could seem complicated, begins. Kant isn't just going to let us go from something that's the form of thinking to the form of being. So he wants to say Aristotelian syllogism gives us certain forms of things when we abstract from objects. But what it is to be related to objects, logic until now doesn't tell us that. But not because it's irrelevant to what he would call logic, because we now need to distinguish formal logic from transcendental logic. And so now logic in this richer but also now narrowed Kantian tradition means something. It doesn't just mean what a logician does. It means the forms of thought still. And Wittgenstein's teachers, Frege and Russell, still think about logic that way. When they are putting forward their logical systems, they are trying to codify what is the form of our thinking anyways. They're trying to bring out the structure of judgment. They don't think about it the way Hilbert started to think about it and became more popular after that, where we can think first that we have some symbols and we put them together, and then we can interpret them and say it's a model of something. Now, what Frege is doing in Begriffsschrift and what Russell thought he was initially doing Principia was bringing out. So thus in both these books there's a strict distinction between what you can write in ordinary sentences of German and English and what you write in the syllogism. Modus ponens, Frege says, is the basis of my system, so it cannot be expressed in it. And the reason we have the judgment stroke in Frege is because these are thoughts we must be thinking to grasp the system. So, but what you have in these figures that starts to happen is the idea that we can codify these forms. So they take the outer aspect of what the mathematician might call calculus. And then we can see what's valid or not by formal rules, simply by manipulating the calculus. That's the beginning of a way of thinking about logic that can then be free from any philosophy about what the form of thought and logic is. But Wittgenstein, when he's criticizing the Tractatus, which inherits this conception of logic from Frege and Russell, says he wants to distinguish in the 30s between two conceptions of logic. What he calls logic as calculus and logic as grammar. And the thing I think he's most interested in is what he calls logic as grammar, not logic as calculus. And so if one's come to think of logic as calculus, where the investigation of the calculus is independent of an investigation into the form of thought or the essence of things, then what he'll say is very peculiar. But I think he's very conscious here of trying to make this separation.
Yeah. I'd like to add just one point to this about the historical side of the word logic, which is that having taught for 8 years in a Scottish university, I'm very aware of the way in which philosophy, as we understand the whole field of philosophy, was understood historically as divided into two departments in Scottish universities, logic and moral phil. The logic side was everything that wasn't the part of the practical side. And logic, just as it were, was the entirety of what we might now think of as metaphysics, epistemology, and what we would now call logic.
So what's peculiar, this, from your point of view, this expansion of logic isn't something that Wittgenstein's just invented.
Yeah.
He's inheriting something.
Is there this distinction about logic as a grammar and logic as a calculus already with the players?
Well, I think the point is the Tractatus thinks it's both at once. And the point, it's both, must have this truth-functional character that can be expressed in notation, and it's the form of thought and language. And when the investigation starts to pull these apart, it's to leave room for the question whether something that has the form of a calculus can be adequate to our purposes in wanting to do a grammatical investigation.
Very traceable, this distinction between the players, do you think so?
Well, I think both aspects in the Tractatus, but the distinction is a distinction which allows the things to come apart. And that's not in the Tractatus.
I'm sorry, well, I have 6 proper names on my list, but it's only 1:15, and I think we have to stick to the schedule rather
Can we
strictly
start with
because
those
they're waiting
6?
for lunch.
Yeah.
So I would just suggest to continue the discussion at 2:30, and I've got these 6 names on my list, and we should now try to get down to the Grüne Baum and continue